Okay. So I think I'm recording now. All right. So just like I mentioned, this is a cloud platform. Um, it's one of the popular and simple cloud platforms to use. We have a lot of them, right? But I've been using Linode for a long time. I think probably the same year or the second year after they launched, right? I use some of their early, services. I love exploring cloud platforms, especially when they launch, just to, get a feel of, what they have, the services they offer, how it works, right? Even when Alibaba Cloud launched, I think I used it probably for the first month, right, with a friend of mine in Delta State. It always feels different, using it for the first time, seeing the thinking process of this, platforms of the people managing these platforms and how they, grow into something amazing, right? So I would always recommend that if you also see something, just you don't need to dive so deep into it. Just try to understand what it does and move on, get back to your focus area, have a focus area. Okay, so just like we're learning Linode right now, I believe our focus area is Microsoft Azure. We're not there, but it makes sense that we understand some of these things so that it will be easy, for you to use some of those platforms. Okay, so a Linode is simply a cloud-based virtual machine, right? So it's your VPS. It's called a Linode here. On AWS, they call it an EC2, right? On other platforms, they have their unique names. Okay, so here it's simply a Linode, right? We have images, and images are simply items that you've created or you've stored here that you can reuse later. You can download and use for other things. We can basically create a Linux machine and set up an image from there, or we can just create an image from here. We'll get to look at that as well. Kubernetes is something I don't teach beginners, especially if you don't have a lot of experience doing DevOps deployments and all that. But it's simply a way to set up, deployment in a form where we call it orchestration, right? You're able to have a service that can manage deployment. It makes it easy, right, to deploy, to take down some of those pods, right, set up new pods, basically automate the deployment process. It is not an easy platform to learn and use, but when you learn and you understand how to use it, I think it makes life easier for you, um, when it doesn't crash, right? So long it doesn't crash, you're safe. If it crashes on you, I mean that's crazy. So yeah, we have Stack Script, which is uh Stack Script is a script for automating deployment. Basically, from this company, which is Linode, now known as Akamai, right? So you can run those scripts to install and configure software when you are initializing a Linode compute instance. So it's simply like using Ansible, but in this case, right here on this platform. I don't think Stack Script can be used on other platforms, right? I believe it's simply for, or maybe it can be, right? I think I've only tried it here on Linode, but we can check, right? So write a custom script for use with types with the Stack Script, run custom scripts, and initialize Linode compute instances. So I think it's simply for Linode, right? Um, yeah, I think it's simply for Linode, because I haven't used it elsewhere. I mean, I came across it on this platform and I've tried it, but yeah, just here. Okay, so we have the marketplace. By the way, we have placement groups, a way to group your components and have them sit within same region, or yeah, basically a logical way to group and structure your services that you have running on Linode. Okay, we have the marketplace. Yeah, the marketplace simply contains images from these companies, right? Probably set up by the company themselves and assigned to Linode so that Linode can put it in their marketplace, or Linode can be the one configuring this and setting them here as images that you can simply click to deploy, right? So you don't have to configure these things yourself. If I click on Apache Spark, when I create a Linode out of this marketplace image, it's already configured, right? To work, to boot up and to spin up that Apache Spark instance, right? So whichever option we select here, if it's WordPress, you're spinning up a Linode instance that is fully set up to run WordPress. Okay, so you don't have to do that again manually. But of course, You still need to learn how to manage it, right? If you don't know how to manage, a VPS, because you are still setting up a VPS. Okay. Okay. So you see, you can actually create right here in the marketplace. You can decide to just select an OS, instead of going with. You can decide to switch to selecting an OS. Sorry, instead of going with the images here. I think the images here would help us, especially if you are not, very good with managing this Linode instance. If you're not very technical and you want to set up an application, I don't think you would want to set up Apache, Kafka, Spark, or any of the Apache stuff here if you're not very technical. But you might want to set up Upright, which is going to sit as a backend for your application. We have Bodybase, which is also doing something similar, but I think it's mostly for things related to forms, I believe, right? No code related stuff. I think I've tried it before. I think it's no code. I believe it's no code, so you can check it out as well. Yeah, we have Docker, we have Django, we have Discourse, which is a community platform. We have a lot of things here that you can simply, we call it one-click deployment, right? A lot of people like it, right? You're working with a company, they ask you to set up a main stack server, right, where you have Mongo, Express, Angular, and Node. Main stack A means Angular, correct? Yeah. Man, arrow means React. So I think I'm right. But yeah, if I'm wrong, you can of course correct me in the chat. We have Moodle. So I've deployed most of these applications myself. Minecraft Moodle, which is basically a learning platform. And if there's a way to deploy it automatically, I think it makes life easier for you. You just click and deploy. So yeah, this is good. All right. So in the storage section, you see the way they've separated these items. We have I think 4 categories here. We have compute storage, we have database, and yeah, and networking. Okay, compute storage, networking, and database. So monitor is basically the observability option that they have, which is long view, right? Just like AWS, most of you have heard of CloudWatch, right? Here they use long view. Yeah, and of course you have your accounts and help and support. Okay, so let's go back to compute. Linode are those VPS that you can create. So if I click on create a Linode instance, I just have to select a region. So we can go with Frankfurt, for example. We can go with Frankfurt, which is EU Central. We can select the operating system, and I'll go with Ubuntu 24, which has long-term support. We can select shared memory because dedicated CPU quite expensive for our class. So let's go with I think the lowest option, shared CPU, which is about oh, this is even good, 1 GB of RAM for $5. I think this is good. So storage, you have 25 gig. Transfer speed, you have 1 TB, and network in and out, this is 40 Gbps. Okay, so let's select the lowest option here, which is nano. We can set up a label or a name for our instance. So let's just call this simple Python app. Okay, so I have 3 P's here, take off 1. So we can add tags. Now, how do you use tags? So let's say you have 2 clients you're working for, and each of these clients have their respective applications you're building. And let's say per client you have 3 applications you're building, maybe 1 front end, 2 back ends, or 1 front end, 1 back end, and 1 background service. You can use the name of the client as a tag for these 3 services, so that by the time you open Linode, you can simply filter by tag, and you have the applications. Let's assume you have a lot of applications here. You can filter by the tag, and if you select the tag, which is the name of the client, for example, Marv or Marvelous, you are able to get all the applications that you deployed for that client. Okay. Yeah, so for this case, I'll just put in Marv as a tag, right? And for the placement group, of course, you can have multiple tags. You can see that here. Okay. For the placement group, if you are working with a placement group, I don't have any, but it's basically telling the application, okay, I want this application to be placed within this region, which is what I've created as a placement group. So when I'm creating any other application, I just have to select that group, and it would basically put that application in the same placement group. Okay, so I can enter a root password, something strong, but I usually just go to Bitwarden, and I generate a password. So I go to generator, and I can get a password from here and make it more difficult, but you have to make sure you save this somewhere, because it's going to haunt you if you don't remember it. Okay, so I don't want to use SSH for now, but SSH it's simply SSH keys. They're simply a way to log in with without having to put password. So it's passwordless login, right? You can simply set up a new SSH option here. You download the key on your machine, and then you can log in with that key from your terminal, right? Or you can generate a key before bringing it here. So using SSH generator, key generator. But we're not doing that, right? So let's just ignore that. If you want to learn how to do this, I think I have other videos on the Top Universe YouTube channel I can share with you, right? Or I can make a video specific for that. Yeah. Okay, so we don't have like a VPC set up here, right? So we don't need to select this, but oh, I also see that this VPC is not, available in this region I selected, right? Which is, where is it? Where is that region? Where is it? Oh, that's placement group. Yeah, right here. So we can actually change that region, right? So that we can set up a VPC. By the way, VPC, Virtual Private Cloud, it's a way to, set up a space where you can actually deploy applications and then choose to set up like firewalls that can determine what goes out of that VPC and what comes into that VPC. We call it, security groups basically, but other platforms can give it different names, right? Firewalls, security groups. You're trying to protect, what you have within the VPC. So you can have multiple services, multiple Linodes, put inside the VPC. Yeah, so that when you set up the rule of that VPC, it controls, every single application, right? In terms of what comes in and what goes out, and the policies you set around it. Okay, so we'll get to explore VPC more when we cover Microsoft Azure, right? It will be more interesting then, but I mean, I will just probably, let's see, Excalibur. So let me just try to explain this again with a simple image. So let's assume that we have a machine here. This is a backend application. So let's call this maybe John. Okay, let's just say we're building something related to identity. So I can say identity API, right? So for the identity API, let's yeah, we have some front-end applications that work with the identity API. So we can call the first one Auth UI, right? Maybe built with React or any other framework, React, Svelte, or what have you. So we have this, and we have this is going to be server-side rendered. So let's say we deploy this using, of course, Node, right? We basically render this. We have like an Express server or a Node HTTP server running, and we just serve the front end that we've built already. So if you have something like this, this is running in a Linode. So let's just duplicate, not save. So this is running in a Linode instance. Okay, and you have another one running in another Linode instance. So let's come here and so this is also being served, and probably this is with Angular. Let's say this is like a sports betting app or something. So you have this, an Angular app also served with Node. And then you have this, maybe we can say this is just a C# application or Java application. So this is also running on a Linode instance, right? So let's just duplicate this. Now, where does VPC come in? Since this is going to be deployed on the same account, right? We can decide to just put everything, just like this. Send this to back. Okay. So we can decide to put everything within a VPC. This is the VPC right here. I just discovered my account was deleted. Oh, okay. We can create another one. So we have our VPC. We can configure what I called the firewall. So we can just say this is firewall, right? So let's say this is firewall. Okay. So if you have this, the assumption is that when you configure, inbound and outbound. So you have inbound. Inbound is basically describing, the traffic that comes in, right? So the traffic coming into this, okay, and outbound, right? The traffic leaving this VPC, which is from these applications, okay. So I can just point I don't want to point to everything here. Let's just put it here. But the point is this arrow you're seeing here basically means something like this, right? Actually, if I represent it this way, I think it's easier to understand what I'm talking about. Inbound is saying, the traffic that goes into all these, all these services as well. So I'll probably just put it on the other side, like this. So this is what is going in, right? Just like this. Okay. Okay. So this is inbound. This is outbound. So you can actually configure this from a firewall, from a VPC level. You can say, okay, what can access this, VPC, what should not be able to access, this VPC. And then when you get to the Linode level itself, you can then configure additional firewall rules as well, right? But this, serves as a way to create like a private, isolated cloud for you where you can basically, perform all these activities, have multiple services that can probably communicate with each other. So you can say, any service within this VPC can communicate with another service that I have within the VPC. But services that are trying to access this, platform or this, Linode instance from outside of this VPC should not be able to, right? So you can configure things like that. Okay, hope that makes sense. All right, so let's continue, right? Yeah, we can basically select backups, which is good if you are, building like a production system, especially if it's a database related stuff. You can set up a private IP, which is very important because if you don't have a private IP, what might happen is that when you restart your Linode instance, you lose the previous IP. Meanwhile, you might have tied that IP, to Cloudflare or to some, DNS uh, service, or you might have configured it, to some A records like your domain name, obviously, right? So if you tie it to a domain name and then you restart and you lose that IP, the domain name will not be able to resolve, that previous IP. So, your website or your application will not be able to load. Okay. Hope that makes sense. All right. So if I click on create Linode, this is going to create my Linode instance. While that is, let's say never. Okay, so while this is provisioning, we can just move on to the other things. I forgot to copy that password. Uh, oh, I think yeah. Let's write it down somewhere. Notepad. Okay. All right. Let's come back here. And yeah, images. So just like I mentioned earlier, we can actually create an image. We just have to, select, the Linode instance that we've created, right? We're trying to build an image from there, so we can, use it. We can basically deploy that application multiple times. Sometimes we can actually, yeah, it's something we might want to do. Maybe you deploy something today, but you say, oh no, we don't need to deploy this now. We want to deploy this next month, but I need to just save this image. So by next month, I can just spin it up without having to do all those configuration I've done before, right? So you can also select a disk. We don't have a disk that we've created. If we create a volume, then oh yeah, so we have a default disk that came with that Linode. Remember, there was a 25 gig storage allocated, right, to that Linode instance. So that is what you're seeing here. Okay, which you have to select because it is part of this. Now that you're creating like that image, so you have to select the Linode and the disk attached to it. If you have additional disks, of course, you can choose to attach that disk to the Linode instance as well. So this is where you put the image detail, the name, right, as well as the tag. Remember, we created a tag called Marv. I can't find it. I think we removed it. I think we removed it because if we created it, it should be here. Okay, so this image is cloud init compatible. Nope, I'm not doing that. So let's just create this image. I'm going to delete that afterwards anyways. So you see the image is also creating. It's currently in the pending state, so we don't have a size. There is a way to actually like set up images. You can deploy this. As you can see, you can deploy that image. You can rebuild the existing Linode of that image, and then you have a new version of the image, simply like that. Yeah. And right, so you can deploy this multiple times. Okay, so let's look at I think I've explained marketplace and how it works, but let's assume we have let's see what can we set up. So Git here is a good use case here. So Git here is basically Git but open source, so you can deploy your own version of Git, right? So all I have to do is select Git here, so which I have done now. Let's see. So I have it displayed right here. I can enter the password for some of these things here. So let's use similar password I have here. So let's paste. Let us paste, which is our Git here database. We don't need to enter some of these fields here, right? So the password for the limited sudo user, this is compulsory, I believe. SSH key will be used to access. I don't think that's compulsory. If it's not, then I'll prefer not to, go with that. So enable passwordless sudo. This is no, that's fine. Disable. Okay, configure. I would leave some of the defaults. Your Linode API token is needed to create a DNS record. Oh, come on. Don't really have that. But I'll probably just stick to this password I just pasted here. That might not work because it's strictly requesting for Linode API token. Yeah, so that might not necessarily work. I think it needs that to be able to connect or detect your domain. So where is the domain session here? Let's see, networking. So yeah, domains. I think it needs that to be able to detect the domains when you log into Gitya, right? So that you can configure a URL that you can use to access the yeah, but we should be able to do that even after deployment. So I don't think that's compulsory, but let's see. If we are using a subdomain, we can set up that subdomain. So now it says domain is required. I don't have a domain I can put here, so I'm probably not going to deploy this stuff. If I'm using another platform like Gitpod, Gitpod, I think I've tried this several times. I think it can, you can't deploy Git here without going through all this, process. Okay. There are so many applications you can deploy this way, right? There are some requirements. As you can see, these are requirements that we do not have, so we will not be able to, create those services, right? I'm sure there are some of them we can set up without those plenty requirements, e.g., Node, right? So for Node, we just have to put in some, minor information, and we'll click on Create Linode, right? The Linode instance will create then, comes by default with Node because it was already configured in the image that we have here on the marketplace. Okay, so for storage, we have objects and we have volumes. Okay, so if I click on object storage, this is basically S3 compatible, which means you can use this to store, blob images, blob items, right? We call them blobs. It can be images, it can be videos, it can be music files, MP3, just like the way S3 works for storing items. It can be PDF files, right? So anything objects, right? Anything objects, which are basically those things I've mentioned, videos, images, document files, audio files, right? Those are blob images, blob objects or types, right? So blob types. Yeah, and you can basically store them in here. So I can create a new bucket, right? Remember, it's S3 compatible, which means I can simply use the S3 API as well, or SDK, to access this. It means when I create this, we expect it to give us like a access key and secret key, right? So let's see. Please, can you go over how? Okay, let me see. Okay, please, can you go over how all these connect and relate? Public IP, private IP, VPC, and firewall rules. Okay, we'll get there. All right, so for the label, we can create a label for this. Let's call this our simple Python bucket. Maybe we're building an application that will store images, for example, right? That can be stored here. And we have a region, so yeah, let's go with Frankfurt as well. Click on that. Yeah, so we have an option here. This is $0.02 per gigabyte. So yeah, the more this would scale, the more you pay. So if it exceeds your global network transfer pool, you pay 0.005 per gig. You need to understand this from the pricing section. So, but let's just go ahead and create this enable object storage. Okay, so we have that object, we have that bucket created here. If I click on access keys, you would see, just like I mentioned earlier, we don't have any access key for now, so we can create one. If I create an access key for this, I'm just going to use the bucket name as well. I can set limited access. and configure how this bucket should be accessed. Should we be able to read everything? Should it be read only, read and write, or no access at all? Right? But I can just leave it open for now. Let's just collapse this, and I say create. I think I forgot to select the Frankfurt. Yeah. Okay. So let's go ahead and create. All right, so now that I've created this, you see we have the access key and the secret key. So with these two information here, you can simply, perform the actions you want to perform against these buckets, add items, delete items. So you must make sure that your secret key is safe, right? Nobody should have your secret key, and you are only going to get this once, because once you close this place, I don't think you should be able to access secret key again, although you can access the, access key. So if you forget the secret key, you would most likely create a new one, right? To access the bucket, you have to delete this one, create a new secret key and access key to access that bucket that you've created. Okay. All right. So I hope that makes sense. I'm going to delete this so that we don't get to use it. So let me revoke this, and I'll delete the bucket as well. So to answer your questions before I move on, let me start by deleting this. So I need to enter this name, which is simple Python bucket right here, and I can delete this bucket. Okay, so I'm looking at your question, John Michael. Can you go over how all this relate? Okay, so I can see your questions now. Let's pull up Excalibur, and I'll put these questions here. All right, so we have public IP, private IP, and we have VPC and firewall rules and policies. Okay, so I'm going to keep it simple here. So VPC, just like I explained, this is your virtual private cloud, right? So it's just like what's the best example? So okay, good. It's just like you find yourself in a compound, right? You find yourself in a compound. So this is a compound where you all share, what you have in that compound. So you can all share what you have in that compound, right? Maybe things like the toilet, the bathroom, right? The kitchen. Maybe in a way you share kitchen as well. But then you decide to create your own VPC, which is your own private space, right? For some reasons, say you pay for that private space and nobody has the access to use it apart from you because you've paid for it, so you own it, right? So that is simply what we mean by VPC. So whatever you create in here, so let's assume you create a bucket, sorry, or let's assume you create a an instance, like a Linode instance. Let's call it instance Linode instance. Okay. Let's make that smaller. Does that work? Okay, so that is not becoming. I can just make it small. Where's small? Yeah. Okay, so you create this Linode instance. You can have multiple Linode instances in here, and they are all within this VPC, which means when you create this VPC, you automatically have some set of configurations. For example, I would call that like a firewall, right? Now you also have some level of I would say security. There's something called UWF, right, on Ubuntu, for example, which is used to configure UFW, sorry, which is used to configure firewall policies as well. What can be able to access this box, what should not be able to access this box. You can set that on the machine level, right, on the Linode instance level. You can also set some restrictions on the VPC level itself, right? And when you have all these things within the VPC, they can communicate with each other. You can configure them to communicate with each other. It becomes easy, to have them communicate with each other. It becomes easy, to set, access levels and all that in here, because what you're building basically is found within the space, right? So you have a more private cloud you can configure and basically build your applications and deploy your applications to your taste in here. Okay, so on Linode, let's go down to VPC. So I can say create VPC. You see, enable cloud resources to privately communicate with each other, the internet, of course, based on your configuration, and other private networks. Okay, so let's click on create, and I will select a region. And I love going with Frankfurt. I think I'm just used to going with Frankfurt. Okay, I'm just used to Frankfurt. I've been using Frankfurt. I think that was the first when I started using the cloud. They did not have Frankfurt for a long period of time, so I kept using EU Central. But when I mean, EU Central, which is, in Europe here, closer than America, we have some, we have some regions. So these are basically regions that we're selecting, right? We have regions. Within the regions, we have what we call availability zones, right? Which are basically data centers, right? Closest to you, you can select. If you select a particular region, let's say I select the EU Central, or just like I selected Frankfurt, which is DEFRA2. There will be data centers in there, and those data centers will be called availability zones, but not on Linode, right? On Linode, they don't have those options. So I believe in each of these places, they only have one data center, right? Not multiple. If they have multiple, I think they have multiple in Frankfurt. That's why I usually see two options in Frankfurt, right? But no, no, for now I can only see one. When I was creating the virtual machine, right? They had two. But anyways, there are some places where they have two. For example, you see this is India, right? You see they have IN, Chennai, I believe, in Ma. That's the ID, right? And here they have in yeah. So yeah, you get it. So I would most likely say, okay, this is the same place, but we have availability zone 1, availability zone 2. But it's obvious that they have two options here because they're in different locations within India. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Okay, so if you want to learn more about availability zones, you can check AWS or you can check Microsoft documentation. So when we get to Microsoft Cloud, I would also explain that. All right, so now we've selected this. We're still on VPC. We can add a label to this Python app. Hyphen. Okay, so we can add a description, and then we'll get to the point where you see subnets, right? So each VPC can be further segmented into distinct networks through the use of multiple subnets, and the subnet can isolate various functionality of an application. I think where you would actually see this in play more will be when we look into Microsoft Azure, but I'm going to show you an example with the diagram I have here. Okay, so I have one template diagram. I usually let's see, my desktop architecture. I don't think it's this one. This should be a Kubernetes architecture, so I don't think it's this one. Yeah, don't ask again for now. Just open this. Okay, so yeah, not this one. Okay, so not this one. Give me a second. So I would have loved to show you. Okay, yeah, I know where it is, but I don't want to open it because it's against company policy, right? So I can't open up that folder. I have it on my MacBook, but I will just show you from a sample on the web. Maybe next time I would have like my own sample here. So I'm going to show you subnets in AWS images. Okay, so let's go to images. So you see, let's click on this option. So if I click on this option, you see VPC subnet, right? So you see I have my VPC here and I have a region, right? I have the VPC inside the region and I have multiple subnets. This is the first one, the second one, the third one. And then I have internet gateway, which is what allows internet to flow through the subnet. Now, inside each of these subnets, I have an instance, which is an EC2 instance. And each of these EC2 instances are, hosted in different availability zones, as you can see, right? They are all inside the VPC, different subnets, and these subnets can be set to public or private. If it's private, it means you don't want to allow any other thing to communicate, with that particular item or resource that you have within that subnet. If it's public, it means you can basically expose that. You want it to be public. So most times people deploy applications. People deploy applications, and I don't want to open this. Okay, people deploy applications. Let me show you. I think it's better to show an example. Draw.io. Although I saw the notification that our time is almost, elapsing. So, how I wish I could, pull something from that folder, but that is not a good idea. Okay, so you have like what people do most times is they have like a public subnet, a private subnet, right? And they have all these things within the VPC, just like this. Okay, if you have any questions, ask me. Okay, So the VPC definitely sits within a region. All right. So in here you have the region, the AWS region, right? Just like the example I gave earlier, it can be US East 1, just like this. And it works like that for all the cloud. Linode makes it very easy, so you don't have to think about all these things. But if you know these things, good for you. Okay. Now here you have your VPC. Inside that VPC, you can have availability zones, right? You can have multiple items in one availability zone, but let's just keep it to one, right? So availability zone. Okay. So we call them AZs, right? So you have availability zone. Okay. And let's assume that in this VPC, you have what you call a public subnet. So you create a subnet that is public, which means you want other applications to be able to communicate with whatever you have here. And you have private, and here you don't want it to have access to the internet. Although you provide internet access to the VPC level, but it will not get in here because this is private. So let's get an internet gateway. John, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. So we have an internet gateway sit right here, okay? And then you have your users basically access this via an IP. And I'm getting to where you asked that question of IP, okay? So yeah, requests will be able to come into this VPC because you have an internet gateway. If there's no internet gateway, there's no access coming into your VPC, right? In terms of requests, okay? So the request is basically, of course, going to pass through like maybe Route 53 if you have DNS configured, right? And yeah, but let's just abstract all those ones. So let's just say you're trying to access this within with your IP. So in your application, 109 point this, okay? So let's assume you create EC2 instance, and your EC2 instance has an application running on it, maybe like a Python app, right? Python app. And this Python app would render a front end. So this is the default port. This is the default IP that you get from creating your application, which you can actually set up what to call an elastic IP. In Linode, it's called a private IP. Okay. So, but here you have the default IP, which is public, right? And it's IPv4. You can also have a IPv6 address. We'll talk about that maybe next time. Here you have another application which has its own IP, but then this is probably a database. Most times people just want to put their database there so that RODS, let's go RODS, so that you can't have other services communicate except what you have configured that you would want to communicate with, right, yourself. So items within the VPC can talk to each other based on your configuration, of course. Yeah. Okay, I can't seem to get. Okay, so they can talk to each other. Let me just set this here instead. Let's do one just like this. So you have back and forth communication happening here. Through the internet, people can actually communicate to this because it's set to public. Remember, it's in a public subnet. But this is private. So based on your configuration, nothing else should be able to get access to this. It is just this service that I've configured because they are both in the same VPC. If they are not in the same VPC, if you have this sitting somewhere else within your cloud, maybe the same region, but because they're not in the same VPC, you can't just communicate with this. It is private. In a VPC, it is not going to work, right? You have to bring this into the VPC and then put it somewhere in a different subnet or even in the same place if you want to, before you can get access to this. So that is private. Now, speaking of your, let's go back. Okay, so speaking of public IP, private IP, public IP is basically an IP that can be used to access this resource from the web, right? Yeah, so people can connect using this IP. Private IP is just the IP that resources within that specific region, within your space, within that VPC can use to communicate with each other. Yeah, on AWS they also have ARONs, if you have heard of that before, which are basically unique names that these resources can use to communicate with each other, right? They are unique on AWS. Within AWS, they can basically communicate with each other. And you have firewall rules, right? So I mentioned security groups one time. Yeah. So security groups can be used or can be set to as to be firewall rules because you're basically configuring what can come in, what can, leave, right? Which is also tied to your subnets. Subnet has security, your subnet has security groups where you can then set inbound and outbound, right? And yeah, but note that you can also have firewall rules on the instances themselves. So, for example, a virtual machine like this, if you set up Ubuntu, which is Linux, you have UFW, which is what I mentioned earlier. So you might configure your firewall rule on security groups, and then you mess it up here. You will definitely have some issues to deal with. Okay. So, John, I don't know if this answers your questions, or do you still need clarity on any other part? Okay, so let's check. What's the time now? I think we just have a few minutes, I believe, before this call will end. Let me check. 8 minutes. Oh, 8 minutes is good. It's good. We're not going anywhere. We are not going anywhere. All right, let's jump back into this firewalls. Okay, so we have firewalls next. We can create a firewall, and you see what I mentioned earlier: inbound, outbound, right? So you can basically set all these stuffs if you want to accept inbound traffics, or you want to send out requests from your services you have within your VPC. You can do that as well. So let's set up a firewall. And yeah, let's see. Select Linode. We specify the Linode that we want to assign under this firewall. Node balancers. We don't need node balancers, right? We don't even have any available one here. So node balancers are basically load balancers, right? So these platforms just try to differentiate themselves with naming, and which is why I say if you learn how to use one, you most likely understand others. You just need to practice and use them for something realistic. Okay, so yeah, we don't have any node balancer. Let's just go ahead and create this. So right now, using this firewall, I can configure what comes in, which is the inbound rules, right? I can set that here. I want to get HTTP or HTTPS. So if it's HTTP, I can add a description and I can select a protocol. So what is the protocol we're checking for? If we want to send in HTTP requests, which is non-secured requests from your browser, maybe, or from some clients like Postman and all that, we can specify this is an HTTP request. Is we probably expect maybe a TCP connection, sort of, right? And we have a default option which is 80, right? You can add more ports. We have more ports here if you want to access like what's it called, MySQL on that machine. Then of course you want to go with 3306 because MySQL is most likely configured with that port. If you have your own application that you've configured with your own custom port, you can also put that here, right? So that if you try to access this machine, you'll be able to access that item you've deployed, right, with that port. I've been getting notifications. I hope they're not billing me because we're just starting. I just arrived. So let's continue. So for the source section here, I'm expecting like a regular IP, so I can say all IP v4, or I can select both all IPv4 and IPv6, or I can select a particular IP. So you can build an application. You have a database running within a Linode, right? To deploy your own database within a Linode, and you want a specific app you've built and deployed that is running on a specific IP to be the only thing that can access that particular Linode instance that is running your database. This is what you do, right? You configure this and then you select that, you put in that particular IP. So if you have your Linode, right, tied to this firewall, if another person that is not configured here, another IP, tries to access that machine, it wouldn't work, right? It blocks it. But if it's yours with that IP, then it works, right? So that is how you basically begin to secure your instances. Okay, so firewalls are great, very good. You can also configure what goes out here, so you can add outbound rules. All right, so e.g. you build applications, and some of those applications are required to make like API requests to other applications, but then you've blocked everything in the outbound rule and it doesn't work, and you say, oh, it's working on offline, it's working on my laptop, it's not working online, which means you don't know what is going on, right? Sometimes it can be the outbound rule not properly set, blocking your requests, right, from going out of that machine to access other services and stuff. So yeah. Okay, so that's it for firewalls. Yeah, so I said load balancers are basically load balancers. So they are cloud-based load balancing service, but on Linode is called a load balancer. So when you create a load balancer, you can assign like maybe 2 or 3 or 4 instances, Linode instances to it. The way it works is you then configure your request to hit the load balancer first, and your load balancer will decide which of the instances to allocate that request to. So it's most likely that you are deploying the same application on different Linode instances, so that when a request comes, if you have like high traffic, it can manage the load. Okay. By default, it uses an algorithm called round robin, right? Most of the platforms use round robin by default. So they allocate one here, allocate one there, allocate one here, allocate one there. But yeah, you can also get to configure this. So this is what it looks like. You can set the IP, right? With this specific port, and you can add more nodes. This is the only one we have for now, right? So we can basically add more if you have more applications or more instances running the same application. You can set that here. This is where you configure those backend nodes, and you can check and also set the active health checks if you want this to be happening with a TCP connection, HTTP status, or HTTP body. They can always check and send you updates in your email if they think maybe one of your instances is down or dead or something. Okay, and here you can configure your firewall. So we can also include the firewall we already configured earlier. We can set our this is what I mentioned earlier. So you can set your region, and you can select the specific region from here, of course with the availability zone, which is not specified here, like but I believe that is what it is. Okay, you can add a tag. I have a tag called Marv, and we can add the name of our node balancer, which is our load balancer. And when we are done, we create the node balancer. This is $10 per month, which is interesting, very interesting and expensive. But yeah, I think it's worth it. Depends on the kind of application you're building. Okay, so that is it for node balancers. Under storage, I think I skipped volume. So this is the last thing I'll be speaking of today. And maybe next time we can cover database, right? And monitoring with a long view. Okay. So in the volume section, we can create a block storage. A block storage is a storage you can assign to a Linode instance, which is more like a disk, more like your hard drive, right? You can attach your hard drive to your computer and you have more storage. You have attached it. So we can do that here. We can create a volume. We can add a label to that volume. Select a region. So let's go with Frankfurt as well. Attach this to Linode, and we want to create like 500 gig, right? What? Hold on. It seems like, oh, the price is moving with me. Interesting. So let's say I do, let's do 8,000 gig. Oh, okay, the more zeros. Oh, I see. Now that's good. So I can just add like 80 gig, which is $8. That's reasonable for a Nigerian like me. So $8 per month is 80 gig. I think that's actually expensive, compared to AWS, right? 100 gig, $10. That's quite expensive. So I can create this. I have it assigned to that machine. So if this is created and I connect to that machine, I would be able to see this, and as you can see, this is the target. Okay, so I think the call ended already. This call has been recorded, so I would share this with the team. And yeah, interesting one. We'll continue tomorrow. Okay, thanks, and have a wonderful night. Bye.